Hello, hello. Oh, hello everyone. I hope you are still awake. Yes, yes. Okay, wonderful. So we are going to have our friend here, Nate, from Southern Oregon University. Yeah, yes. He's going to talk to us about how do we continue to be very vigilant as we try to be safe online, right? There are a lot of things, and he works at the SUAS SOC, CSOC, right? Okay, yeah. And here we call it CSOC. I think it's similar in some way. And so he's going to talk to us about adversaries in the middle, the cat and mouse game between security professionals and attackers. So please give a welcome applause to our friend Nate. Please, welcome.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, you're using the other one.
Well, I think I might end up using that one because this is being slow. So I'll just use that one. I don't care.
Either way.
Sure.
Please, welcome.
Yes. Okie dokie. Let's get this show on the road. See how much of this thing I can get through in 30 minutes. It's a lot. So, yes, Adversaries in the Middle, the cat and mouse game between cybersecurity professionals and attackers by me. So some of the things I want to cover with this talk is what an adversary in the middle attack is and why we should care. Examine sort of this dichotomy between the techniques and their mitigation strategies that we can use and how it relates to this cat and mouse game, this back and forth that we've been seeing throughout the years. And you can't talk about adversaries in the middle without first talking about the Cornerstone technique, which is ARP spoofing or ARP poisoning, so I have to talk about that too. I also kind of want to terrify you with how bad this can potentially be if we don't use these protection strategies that we already have in place. And so I will show you an example of that as well. And then some additional protection mechanisms that we can use to help protect against this. And throughout the presentation, there will be some QR codes. You're more than welcome to scan them. And they'll take you to a website that has more resources about that topic or expansion on the topic or so on. And if there's any time left over, which I guarantee there won't be, some extras. So this story right here is really why we should care. So in 2019, there was an adversary in the middle attack that managed to redirect $1 million wire transfer that was from a Chinese venture capital firm to an Israeli startup company. And the way they were able to accomplish this is that they registered 2 email domains that were similar to each company's own. In the case of the Israeli startup company, this was an identical email with an additional S at the end. In the case of the Chinese venture capital firm, it was similar, but also had an additional S at the end. So just kind of an interesting thing there. So this wire transfer was sent but never received. And the entire reason for that was because this adversary was seeing emails from both sides. So the Israelis company was thinking they were sending all their emails to the Chinese venture capital firm, and the other way around. So the adversary was able to read all of their emails and change any details that they saw fit when they saw these things. Or they could just forward them on if nothing needed to be changed. And so one of the key details that they changed was the account that they had access to. So most critically, what they were able to do is cancel a in-person meeting where the bank account would have been finalized, but they were able to cancel it because they sat perfectly in the middle of this transfer communication. So they were able to see, oh, this in-person meeting is taking place, say, 2 months from now, and they just sent a couple emails. Oh, hey, I can't make it for this day because blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of terrifying. Throughout this entire chain of events, the adversary sent 18 emails to the Chinese and 14 to the Israeli company. And you would think that after getting such a big payday that they would just abscond into the wind and take their money and run. But they were not. As of when the story was written in 2019, this adversary continues to email the Chinese venture capital monthly. And the story just perfectly fits what this type of attack is capable of. And with enough time and patience, the adversary was able to net an incredible payday. So the term used to be man in the middle, but it has since been changed to adversary to make it more inclusive. So an adversary in the middle is just one who may attempt to gain access to a network, position themselves between some network devices. They can use techniques such as ARP poisoning or ARP spoofing to facilitate this. They can also exploit a DNS server so that users will connect to a malicious website that they host. They could snip network credentials. if it's just plain text in HTTP. So Etercap, which we'll be looking at later, is one sophisticated tool that adversaries can use to sort of enhance this type of stuff that they do. And so adversary in the middle is as much of a tactic as it is with the specific techniques that comprise it. So now, let's move on to this cat and mouse dichotomy. And so when I say these things are solutions, I don't mean that this is a solved problem. I simply mean that this is a mitigation strategy that we can use in order to help protect us against this specific thing. So, but now we need to figure out who is the cat and who is the mouse. So I would submit to you that the adversaries are the mouse. They are quite crafty, they are overly intelligent, and in some cases they can just be insanely lucky and then everything just works out for them. So, I know exactly who we should pick. Pinky and the Brain. So we'll let Pinky and the Brain be our stand-in for our adversary mouse in this case, which means we need a suitable stand-in for a cat. So we need a cat that is just diligent, always hardworking, but can't ever seem to quite get that goal, is always 2 steps behind. I know, Tom. That is a perfect example for this. Tirelessly hardworking, always 2 steps behind Jerry the mouse. So now that we have our stand-ins, let's take a look at some of these problems and their mitigation strategies. So this sort of back and forth nature can really be seen with 2 specific examples on this slide. So at first, it's just HTTP where there was no encryption. You can sniff the credentials out of the air, read all the messages because it's just plain text, words on the page. The solution that the security professionals came up with was HTTPS, just encrypting the data in transit. And adversaries obviously didn't like that, so they came up with something called SSL stripping in order to take this data and effectively convert between HTTP and HTTPS. And then security professionals saw that, like, oh, well, now we need to get around this. And so their strategy was to use HSTS and then HSTS preloading. Another really good example of this is the Wi-Fi security chronology. So first we had open, then WEP, which was okay for the time, but as we now know is very bad, don't use it. And then we had WPA, which was slightly better, still bad, don't use it. And now the most commonly available thing is WPA2 for most home routers. And the newest standard is WPA3, which still isn't widely commercially available yet, but it's getting there. And while it is the newest Wi-Fi standard, a recent study by, forgive me for these names, Matthew Van Hoef and I.L. Ronan were able to uncover several vulnerabilities in the Dragonfly handshake that WPA3 uses. So think about it. This is a product that's not even on the market yet, and we already have these vulnerabilities being found. So, and again, it's just problem comes up, we fix it. Problem comes up, we fix it. And just so on and so forth down the line. So now let's take a look at some of these in greater detail. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about HTTP. We know it's bad. You can sniff credentials out of the air. Just use Wireshark. It's easy. It's not sophisticated. We don't care. So, and again, HTTPS, don't need to spend too much time on that. We know it's better. It encrypts the data in transit. Okay. So now let's look at the way HTTPS is supposed to work. So to have a secure connection, you have to be connected on port 443 and have a valid SSL certificate. The client goes to a website and says, hey, I want to connect to your website. The web server replies, no, you cannot. Come back on port 443. And this might be in the form of a 301, a 302, or a 307 response, for example. The client says, okay, that's fine. I will now connect on port 443 and use HTTPS. Web server sends its site certificate, and it's okay. Everything's good in the world, right? Well, not really. So the adversary can actually exploit this redirection step when the web server tries to get the client to reconnect over port 443. And so basically what ends up happening is the adversary is able to sit perfectly in the middle of the client and the web server, effectively converting HTTPS to HTTP. So as far as the web server is concerned, it's happy. It sees the HTTPS. And the client is happy because they can see the website, but what they don't know is that the adversary is gathering other data in the meantime. So the solution to this is HSTS. And to put simply, HSTS is defined in RFC 6797 if you're curious about the technical specifications. It's just a header that is stuck into the website that redirects the web browser to use HTTPS. So when the first time you connect to a website over HTTP, the web browser sees this header and goes, okay, I will remember until this time to live value gets there to only ever come back on HTTPS, port 443. And then, cool, that definitely is a very big strategy that we can use. And it's not really that hard to set up. If you have a valid SSL certificate, that's one piece of the puzzle. And these are some of the specifications that you need. And I highly recommend going to hstspreload.org or scanning that QR code right there. Again, it'll be available at the end. to sort of see like what the standards are for this header, and then also to get on the HSTS preload list. It also has a nifty tool where you can see what websites are compliant with HSTS header and are on this list. There's some interesting things about that I'm going to just obfuscate for now. So preloading list, is this a better solution? So basically what this list is that it's a list of all of the websites that comply with this header. And so what happens is that the first time you connect to a website, the web browser will scan this internal list instead. And so when it does that, it will see this website and just connect to port 443 HTTPS automatically, thereby bypassing that initial redirection step. So this is why it's better to use this than just HSTS alone. But technically, both of these are still vulnerable to an NTP-based attack where you trick the computer into thinking that the certificate has expired or the time to live value has exceeded. So there is still a way around that. And basically the biggest problem with this is the adoption rate. So this is a study that shows that about 40,000 websites as of November 7th of 2017 use HSTS and are on this list. And you think of how many websites are out there on the internet. This is just a sheer insurmountably tiny number. And so this is another sort of example. I'm just going to kind of read this out for emphasis. Adoption rate of HSTS preload lists seems to be practically nil for essential industries like finance, and a significant percentage of entries are test sites or are non-functional. This was a study by Roig, JV, and Gatula and Younes in 2019. They took this data from 2017 that we saw on the last slide, and they went through 377 banks in Asia manually. And they just said, are these things compliant with this? You know, are they on this list? Are they using HSTS? And the answer is no. 2 banks out of 377 banks in Asia use this. And they also discovered that 125 of them just didn't have a dedicated website. Okay, I guess that's a thing too. And you might be thinking to yourself, okay, yeah, but this is 2017, that was 5 years ago. Surely it's better now. Well, no, it's not, and don't call me Shirley. So basically, a survey from W3Techs found that less than 25% of the top 10 million visited websites by October 1st of this year use HSTS. And this doesn't even get into some of the other problems that this could potentially have. So another problem this has is scalability. We're supposed to store this list on every web browser in the world for every website. Like that's not scalable. That's not a good idea. So we need to do something about this. And I would submit that maybe the best thing to do is to make HTTPS the default for everything always. And HTTPS should be opt-out and not opt-in. The notable problem with this is that there is a number of sites that just simply aren't HTTPS ready yet. But hopefully what this presentation will show is the importance of outreach that our community can do to enhance the security throughout the internet. Anybody can check using HSTS preloads tool to see if their site or if a site that they use every day is compliant on this. And there's some really interesting results. Play around with that tool. It is hilarious, trust me. So another problem along with the theme of why the heck aren't we using this thing is the problem posed by DNS spoofing, poisoning injection, insert your narrative here. Basically, what the goal of the attacker with DNS is to somehow force the user to connect to a website that is under their control. And while it's not typically a direct example of adversary in the middle, it potentially could be if the attacker is already on the network and uses an IP, like uses IP spoofing to make their machine a fake DNS server, for example. Basically, at this point, it is the point of view of the DNS that is serving as the middle in our adversary in the middle. So the solution for this is DNSSEC. And this is kind of a can of worms, and I'll do my best to explain it as I can. Basically, if you take nothing away, just know that DNSSEC provides data origin authentication and data integrity authentication. And so basically what it does is it establishes a chain of trusted keys to prevent DNS cache poisoning. And so, whoop, see, that's wrong button. Okay. So basically what ends up happening is every zone's public key is signed by the parent zone's private key, with the exception of the root zone that doesn't have a parent. And so that means that if you can trust the root zone's public key, which I think is a pretty fair assumption, that means we can assume to trust the zone that root zone's private key signs, and then the zone that key signs, and so on and so forth down the line. It's more complicated than this, and I wish I could spend more time talking about this, but I don't have the time to do that. Because really the problem I want to get across with DNSSEC is that its adoption rate is equally as abysmal as HSTS preloading is. So if we take a look, so this was some graphs that were shown by Eugene Rosenblum, who was an engineer at AWS. So they examined this adoption rate of DNSSEC, and they figured out that approximately 90% of top-level domains are signed using DNSSEC. Great. That's cool. Now we can all start using this, right? Well, no, because 4% of the top level of the second-level domains that he examined were using this. And then approximately 24% of users were validating it. And that's just an insurmountably tiny number, and this is something that we can do. I don't want to say that this is easy to set up. If you're doing this manually, it can be quite complex. But if your DNS provider is a cloud-based, like Google Cloud, for example, it's really easy to set up. You enable it, and you copy and paste some fields from the DNS itself, and it just basically does most of it for you anyway. It's easier to start with a new one it's easier to start over with a new one than it is to try and import an existing one, but it's still something that we can do to basically enhance the security of the internet through all. But these tools are only useful if we use them. Otherwise, the adversaries will continue to have the advantage in this cat and mouse game. So now that we've discussed some of these various attacks and their mitigation strategies and why we should definitely use them, let's talk about the cornerstone technique of adversaries in the middle, ARP spoofing and ARP poisoning. And we're also going to take a look at some software that is using these attacks, Etercap and ARP spoof. So as a quick reminder for those of you that might not remember how ARP works, it just connects the computer's IP address to their MAC address. So in this diagram, we have host A has a packet meant for host B. It broadcasts an ARP packet out to the network on everything, and it says, hey, I'm looking for the computer that has IP address 10.0.0.22. The server and the router see that and goes, oh, that's not my IP, and they drop the packet. It's not for them. Then host B replies, oh, yep, that's my IP. Here's my MAC address. Here you go. At which point host A can now send the data to host B. So the way that an attacker can exploit this is with ARP spoofing. And basically what they do is they send fake ARP packets in order to link the MAC address with the IP address of their victim. And so in a normal network connection, both the attacker and the victim have two separate connections to the access point. But in ARP spoofing, what ends up happening is the victim, all of their data gets sent through the attacker before being forwarded to the access point. Another thing that you could do with this is you could do some reconnaissance or some stealthy strategies. So if we have Alice and Bob on a network, Alice is our adversary and Bob is the good guy. So Alice can impersonate Bob's computer and try to do something nefarious on a network. And the logs that they might show would be Bob's computer, not Alice's. And this is another thing that they could potentially do. So what this basically looks like is this. PC1 is trying to get out to the router and then the internet, but it needs to figure out what the MAC address of router 1 is to get there. What the adversary can do is they can send an ARP packet of their own back to PC1, claiming that they are the router itself. And when this happens, now there's a link created between PC1 and the attacker, and so it thinks that the attacker is really the router when they're not. And the result of this is ARP poisoning. So after successful ARP poisoning, the attacker can change the ARP table to falsify the MAC table. So what this table is supposed to look like normally is you have host A's IP address linked with the MAC address of host A. And the The IP address of the adversary is linked with the MAC address of the adversary. And then after you successfully ARP spoof, you have the IP address of the adversary linked with the MAC address of host A or host B, depending on what the point of view you're looking at it. So in the case of host A, it will think that the adversary is really host B, but they're not. And so when ARP poisoning is complete, your thing can end up looking like this. So keep this picture in mind as it resembles many of these things going forward. One short caveat with ARP spoofing is that it is very noisy, which is one of the reasons intrusion prevention systems can detect this. And also as a quick aside, one way to prevent this from happening is using either ARP snooping or dynamic ARP inspection, which Juniper Networks supports. But different manufacturers call it different things, but it's effectively the same process, where you're able to prevent these forged ARP packets on your network. But just consult your network infrastructure's documentation for how to set this up. So one package that adversaries can use is ARP spoof. And so when I was experimenting with this package and trying to see like how it worked and whether it was any good, I didn't really have that good of luck with it. It was incredibly slow for me. So I attempted a traceroute experiment where I was like, okay, so I'm a victim, I'm being ARP spoofed. Can I see the attacker doing this to me? And it turns out, sort of. Because it was so slow, everything was a timeout, except for like the very last one and the very first one, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so I went online and I tried to figure out, like, is it ARP spoof? Is it me? Like, what's going on? And sort of what I discovered is that other people have similar problems with ARP spoof, but I don't really know why it was so unbearably slow for me because other people could have used it. And it's okay, but really the package that you want to use to do something like this is Etercap. So Etercap is a comprehensive suite for man-in-the-middle attacks. It features sniffing of live connections, content filtering on the fly, and many other interesting tricks. It supports active and passive dissections of many protocols, including many features for network and host analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying it is better and very powerful. So let's kind of take a look at this. So Etercap, I had much, much better luck with when I was sort of examining this, and it's much faster than ArtSpoof. And the way it works is that it actually has the capability to write packets to a network as well as redirect them as well with ArtSpoofing. It also has the ability to do DNS spoofing, and you can write scripts for this. It has a GUI, which you can use if you're more comfortable with that, or you can set it up just in command line mode if you're using an embedded system for this type of stuff. And it'll automatically do HTTP credential sniffing for you when you set up ArtSpoofing. So what I did here is I set up a intentionally vulnerable web server. I don't remember if it was DVWA or Web for Pen Testers. It was one of those. And so I just went to the SQL example, and I just started typing in passwords to see if I could nab them. And so you can kind of see, admin, password, Blargus, McFlargus, Salty Test Plus, lol, nope. You get the idea. Just some random passwords to demonstrate that this is possible. And this is just with HTTP. This is why we need to use HTTPS. One other thing that Etercap will do is that if you're on the HSTS preload list, it will actually generate SSL errors, which is incredibly important. The more sites that are on that mean it'll be even more difficult for attackers to exploit it. So we've covered the cornerstone of adversaries in the middle, and we looked at some software that can be used in these attacks. So now let's look at a hypothetical attack scenario and sort of show you the true power of how terrifying this can actually be, and hopefully demonstrate why we need to start using these tools. So we have to make a few assumptions first. We have to assume that the attacker has access to a network, whether that's wired or Wi-Fi, and then they have sufficient capable technical knowledge in order to set this up. And so after they do some DNS spoofing or injection or the like, then what happens? Do they just immediately gain profit from that? And that's sort of the place that I wanted to look. Like, okay, so what happens in this like waiting stuff? Like, what can the adversary actually do? So I demonstrated this in my lab secure network. And so for my setup that I use for this, I use an isolated network. With any device, malicious or not, has to connect through. I used a Kali machine to simulate the bad actor. I used an iPhone, a Windows, and a Linux machine to simulate my victims. And the reason for this is I wanted to see if the difference between operating system and the difference between wired or Wi-Fi made any difference. And it didn't. Each one of these is equally vulnerable to anything else. And the reason for that is that adversary in the middle using this DNS stuff effectively bypassing all of the protection mechanisms of the operating system because it's exploiting the nature of the web itself and not the operating system. So the first thing I need to do in order to do this is I need a tool to spoof a website and a website to exploit and some other stuff. So the first thing I need is Apache 2 or insert appropriate web service here. Doesn't really matter. And then I need to figure out a page I need to spoof. So you can use a tool to do it for you like NextFisher. So NextFisher is just built right into Metasploit, and because I'm running Kali as my bad actor, I can have access to this. And so that's kind of cool. I have the option for Facebook selected, and I can do a traditional login page, a Facebook Messenger login page. It's asking me, like, what do you want me to spoof for you? I will do it gladly, and it will be perfect. But that's kind of limited. So let's do this manually and figure out, if I was a bad actor, how would I go about targeting a specific website and forging this? So the website that I chose to spoof was PortSwigger. And if you're not familiar with PortSwigger, it's basically a security testing site that you can practice offensive security with. And I figured this would be pretty easily spoofable. So it's pretty easy to do. All you do is you load up your developer options, you copy the HTML and the CSS, you throw them into your web server, create a very basic PHP script that just writes these credentials to a file, and it just uses get. I'm going to call this sort of the exploitation crafting phase of this sort of adversary in the middle. And here is really where things start to get interesting, and we'll come back to this idea in a minute. So basically, in this step, we can do just all manner of nefarious things, and we're really limited by our own imagination and our capacity for evil to do this. In my example, though, I just redirect the user to google.com because I don't care, I got their data, they're good to go, whatever. So then you just need to edit the HTML to match the script that you wrote. You can also fix any broken images or broken links as well. And the results, pretty bang spot on, actually. The only thing missing is that giant orange banner, and the reason it's missing is because I forgot to copy an image. And because that image wasn't copied, it wasn't the thing, the CSS wasn't correct, and now it's not there. But that's okay. This is a demo. And if an adversary really wanted to exploit this, they could do so just by testing and retesting and perfectly crafting their exploit and their thing that they want to spoof. So it's good enough. But we're not quite done yet. We also have to set up Etercap to do ARP and DNS spoofing for us. And I actually want to talk about the domain that I chose here. I thought blarg.com would be a pretty safe choice, because I really didn't want a real web server's domain to be like a cached record and then interfering with my testing. So, okay, yeah, blarg.com. Well, turns out blarg.com is a real domain, and it's registered and everything. And it points to Avanta Communications, of all place. The more you know. So I went back into this and changed Blargus to Blargus. But this is really why we test in secure environments, to prevent stuff like this from happening. So luckily, nobody owns Blargus.com yet. And then we just need to set our targets. And in this case, the default gateway is target number 1, and our victim, or victims plural, is target number 2. And we also have to start ARP poisoning. Easy enough. Load our DNS spoof plugin. Again, easy enough. Just click, drop down menu, click, done. We've already set up everything we need to do. Should be good to go. So the results of this is after the victim enters their username and their password, I just redirect them somewhere. We're done. We don't really care. So what happens next? Well, it sort of depends on the adversary's goals. So let's go back to that exploitation crafting thing for a minute. So yeah, you could try to do the standard thing of just trying to log in onto their behalf log into their behalf on that website, forward their credentials somewhere else. But what else could we do? And so this idea I was kind of fascinated with. So I'm like, what else could I do with this? Well, I have access to Kali, and therefore I have access to Metasploit, and therefore I have access to Meterpreter. So there's no conceivable reason why me, as an affluent adversary, would want to put a Meterpreter link on this website that I am spoofing. And so now when the user clicks a link, they might download this Meterpreter exploit instead. And for those of you that aren't aware, Meterpreter is a command and control executable that will give a victim just pure control, or an adversary pure control of a victim's machine. You could forward their credential to a bank or other applications, but really the possibilities are endless, and they're only limited by our own imagination, our capacity to do evil, and the technology at which we have access to and the knowledge about. So let's go back to this idea. We use Etercap to our poison network. Phase 2, we craft our exploit expertly, and then what? Well, I would argue that I hope I have sufficiently demonstrated that in this phase right now, we have unlimited power to do whatever we want to the victim's machine because, I mean, let's face it, a user is going to click yes on install Meterpreter if you give them the chance to. So, yeah, not the greatest thing, but oh well. So that being said, we've just seen how powerful adversary in the middle attacks can be, so now let's examine some additional protection mechanisms for this. So I want to look at some business protection, 2 development ideas that can help, before finally wrapping up with a very brief discussion on VPNs. So it does seem hopeless, but these attacks can be prevented and even detected in some cases. In addition to the helpful tools listed earlier, there's more that we can do. So on the business protection end of things, you could use a wireless intrusion prevention system like we use to detect this. User education is just by far one of the most important things you can do. If you can have your users know that they need to manually check the domain of the thing they're trying to log into. Using a strict Wi-Fi device policy, separating your networks into a guest and a secure one, that's just really, really important that we can do. And so on the dev side, you can consider using login protection or user reminder. So SOU shibboleth login services. I attend SOU. I'm allowed to pick on them. Thank you. So basically, every time you try to log into your email, your grades, you're presented with this lovely thing, where it says, I have validated the IP address of this login page, or the address, not the IP, anyway. And it shows in a nice screenshot, this is what you're supposed to expect. And you have to click that, and you have to hit login. And this will totally work for about the first 5 times you see this, and then you're just going to click past it anyway. But there are those users out there that might actually pay attention to this and every time actually use it. So it's potentially a thing that you can consider adding to your website when you log in. Another thing that SOU does is that we enforced strict 2-factor authentication login with Duo. And so 2-factor authentication just makes it, it's just another thing that adversaries have to break into. I don't want to say that it's impossible. There are some shenanigans you can do, and you can actually steal the 2FA token, but it's just much, much more difficult, and they're much more likely to move on to the next target instead. That being said, they're much more likely to just spam you with 1 billion notifications at 2 o'clock in the morning. But that is obviously very noisy, and that now the adversary is, the victim knows they're being targeted by the adversary, and they're much more likely to change their password, so there is that. So VPNs are another really good thing we can do, and you can think of the way that they work similarly to the HTTP, HTTPS. So in a nutshell, VPNs just encrypt the information before it ever leaves your machine. And it's also really important to do this if you're a business and you have several remote destinations. So now you can use a VPN to tunnel between your 2 offices, and the data will be secure by way of sniffing in the middle of this and that kind of stuff. So, but that being said, VPNs still have their share of problems too, namely information leaking. You can still see DNS records that are leaked. Also, it won't protect you from a malicious or a compromised VPN service, or entering URLs into a malicious website, because it doesn't matter if it's encrypted if you're just going to hand it over to them anyway. Go figure. So, in conclusion, adversary in the middle is a very powerful technique in the adversary's tool belt, but it's not very common because of the level of sophistication of physical access that the adversary has to have access to. It's much more common on an area like a hotel Wi-Fi, coffee shop Wi-Fi, that kind of stuff where it's just open. But it's one potential thing that they can use towards their goal. So if their goal is the CIO, CFO network credentials and they're not being successful with the spear phishing, this might be what they try next, just to sort of, if that's what their goal is. And realistically, basically the adoption rates of the 2 tools I mentioned earlier, some of them is just abysmal. But we really have to use them, because if we don't, we're all just cats hung out to dry by the mice at which we seek. And that's it for me. Oh, by the way, don't scan random QR codes from things you don't trust.